before. There was no reply from Lori. She was at the cemetery gates now, reaching through the ironwork to operate the latch. She succeeded. Pushing one of the gates open far enough to slip through, she entered. Reluctantly, Cheryl followed. "Why so many?" Lori said again. It wasn't simply curiosity that had her voice the question. It was that this strange spectacle made her wonder again if Boone had simply been cornered here by accident, or whether Midian had been his destination. Was somebody buried here he'd come hoping to find alive, or at whose grave he'd wanted to confess his crimes? Though it was all conjecture, the avenues of tombs seemed to offer some faint hope of comprehension the blood he'd shed would not have supplied had she studied it till the sky fell. "It's late," Cheryl reminded her. "Yes, and I'm cold." "Are you? I'd like to go, Lori." "Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course. It's getting too dark to see much anyhow." "You noticed?" They started back up the hill toward the town, Cheryl setting the pace. What little light remained was almost gone by the time they reached the outskirts of the town. Letting Cheryl march on to the car, Lori stopped to take one final look at the cemetery. From this vantage point, it resembled a fortress. Perhaps the high walls kept animals out, though it seemed an unnecessary precaution. The dead were surely secure beneath their memorial stones. More likely, the walls were the mourners' way to keep the dead from having power over them. Within those gates, the ground was sacred to the departed, tended in their name. Outside, the world belonged to the living, who had nothing left to learn from those they'd lost. She was not so arrogant. There was much she wanted to say to the dead tonight, and much to hear. That was the pity of it. She returned to the car, oddly exhilarated. It was only once the doors were locked and the engine running that Cheryl said, "There's been somebody watching us." "You sure?" "I swear. I saw him just as I got to the car." She was rubbing her breasts vigorously. "Jesus, my nipples get numb when I'm cold." "What did he look like?" Lori said. Cheryl shrugged. "Too dark to see," she said. "Doesn't matter now. Like you said, we won't be coming back here again." True, Lori thought. They could drive away down a straight road and never look back. Maybe the deceased citizens of Midian envied them that. Chapter 9. Touched. 1. It wasn't difficult to choose their accommodation in Sheer Neck. There were only 2 places available, and one was already full to brimming with buyers and sellers for a farm machinery sale that had just taken place, some of the spillage occupying the rooms at the other establishment, the Sweetgrass Inn. Had it not been for Sarah's way with a smile, they might have been turned away from there, too. But after some debate, a twin-bedded room was found that they could share. It was plain but comfortable. "You know what my mother used to tell me," said Cheryl, as she unpacked her toiletries in the bathroom. "What?" "She used to say, 'There's a man out there for you, Cheryl. He's walking around with your name on.' Mind you, this is from a woman who'd been looking for her particular man for 30 years and never found him. But she was always stuck on this romantic notion. You know, the man of your dreams is just around the next corner. And she stuck me on it too, damn her. Still? Oh yeah, I'm still looking. You'd think I'd know better after what I've been through. You want to shower first?" "No, you go ahead." A party had started up in the next room, the walls too thin to muffle much of the noise. While Cheryl took her shower, Lori lay on the bed and turned the events of the day over in her head. The exercise didn't last long. The next thing she knew, she was being stirred from sleep by Cheryl, who'd showered and was ready for a night on the town. "You coming?" she wanted to know. "I'm too tired," Lori said. "You go have a good time." "If there's a good time to be had," said Cheryl ruefully. "You'll find it," Lori said. "Give him something to talk about." Cheryl promised she would and left Lori to rest. But the edge had been taken off her fatigue. She could do no more than doze, and even that was interrupted at intervals by loud bursts of drunken hilarity from the adjacent room. She got up to go in search of a soda machine and ice, returning with her calorie-free nightcap to a less than peaceful bed. She'd take a leisurely bath, she decided, until drink or fatigue quieted the neighbors. Immersed to her neck in hot water, she felt her muscles unknotting, and by the time she emerged, she felt a good deal mellower. The bathroom had no fan, so both the mirrors had steamed up. She was grateful for their discretion. The catalogue of her frailties was quite long enough without another round of self-scrutiny to swell it. Her neck was too thick, her face too thin, her eyes too large, her nose too small. In essence, she was one excess upon another, and any attempt on her part to undo the damage merely exacerbated it. Her hair, which she grew long to cover the sins of her neck, was so luxuriant and so dark her face looked sickly in its frame. Her mouth, which was her mother's mouth to the last flute, was naturally, even indecently red, but taming its color with a pale lipstick merely made her eyes look vaster and more vulnerable than ever. It wasn't that the sum of her features was unattractive. She'd had more than her share of men at her feet. No, the trouble was she didn't look the way she felt. It was a sweet face, and she wasn't sweet, didn't want to be sweet, or thought of as sweet. Perhaps the powerful feelings that had touched her in the last few hours, seeing the blood, seeing the tombs, would make their mark in time. She hoped so. The memory of them moved in her still, and she was richer for them, however painful they'd been. Still naked, she wandered back into the bedroom. As she'd hoped, the celebrants next door had quieted down. The music was no longer rock and roll, but something smoochy. She sat on the edge of the bed and ran her palms back and forth over her breasts, enjoying their smoothness. Her breath had taken on the slow rhythm of the music through the wall, music for dancing groin to groin, mouth to mouth. She laid back in the bed, her right hand sliding down her body. She could smell several months' accrual of cigarette smoke in the coverlet she lay on. It made the room seem almost a public place with its nightly comings and goings. The thought of her nakedness in such a room, and the smell of her skin's cleanliness on this stale bed, was acutely arousing. She eased her first and middle fingers into her cunt, raising her hips a little to meet the exploration. This was a joy she offered herself all too seldom. Her Catholic upbringing had put guilt between her instinct and her fingertips. But tonight she was a different woman. She found the gasping places quickly. Was what she pictured now, that knowing sleep was quickly overtaking her, and that she could scarcely pass the night in her present position, she threw off all the covers but a single sheet, put her head on the pillow, and fell into the space behind her closed eyes. 2. The sweat on her body cooled beneath the thin sheet. In sleep, she was at Midian's necropolis, wind coming to meet her down its avenues from all directions at once, north, south, east, and west, chilling her as it whipped her hair above her head and ran up inside her blouse. The wind was not invisible. It had a texture, as though it carried a weight of dust, the motes steadily gumming up her eyes and sealing her nose, finding its way into her underwear and up into her body by those routes, too. It was only as the dust blinded her completely that she realized what it was. The remains of the dead, the ancient dead, blown on contrary winds from pyramids and mausoleums, from vaults and dolmen, charnel houses and crematoria. Coffin dust and human ash and bone pounded to bits, all blown to Midian and catching her at the crossroads. She felt the dead inside her, behind her lids, in her throat, carried up toward her womb. And despite the chill and the fury of the 4 storms, she had no fear of them, nor desire to expel them. They sought her warmth and her womanliness. She would not reject them. "Where's Boone?" she asked in her dream, assuming the dead would know. He was one of their number after all. She knew he was not far from her, But the wind was getting stronger, buffeting her from all directions, howling around her head. "Boone," she said again. "I want Boone. Bring him to me." The wind heard her. Its howling grew louder. But somebody else was nearby, distracting her from hearing its reply. "He's dead, Laurie," the voice said. She tried to ignore the idiot voice and concentrate on interpreting the wind, but she'd lost her place in the conversation and had to begin again. "It's Boone I want," she said. "Bring me—" "No." Again, that damn voice. She tried a third time, but the violence of the wind had become another violence. She was being shaken. "Laurie, wake up!" She clung to sleep, to the dream of wind. It might yet tell her what she needed to know if she could resist the assault of consciousness a moment longer. "Boone," she called again, but the winds were receding from her and taking the dead with them. She felt the itch of their exit from her veins and senses. What knowledge they had to impart was going with them. She was powerless to hold them. Laurie! Gone now, all of them gone, carried away on the storm. She had no choice but to open her eyes, knowing they would find Cheryl, mere flesh and blood, sitting at the end of the bed and smiling at her. "Nightmare?" she said. "No, not really. You were calling his name." "I know. You should have come out with me," Cheryl said. "Get him out of your system." "Maybe." Cheryl was beaming. She clearly had news to tell. "You met somebody?" Laurie guessed. Cheryl's smile became a grin. "Who'd have thought it?" she said. "Mother may have been right after all." "That good?" "That good. Tell all." "There's not much to tell. I just went out to find a bar and I met this great guy. Who'd have thought it?" she said again. "In the middle of the damn prairies, love comes looking for me." She could barely contain her enthusiasm as she gave Laurie a complete account of the night's romance. The man's name was Curtis, a banker, born in Vancouver, divorced, and recently moved to Edmonton. They were perfect complementary, she said. Star signs, tastes in food and drink, family background. And better still, though they'd talk for hours, he'd not once tried to persuade her out of her underwear. He was a gentleman, articulate, intelligent, and yearning for the sophisticated life of the West Coast, to which he'd intimated he'd return if he could find the right companion. Maybe she was it. "I'm going to see him again tomorrow night," Cheryl said. "Maybe even stay over a few weeks if things go well." "They will," Laurie replied. "You deserve some good times." "Are you going back to Calgary tomorrow?" Cheryl asked. Yes, was the reply her mind was readying. But the dream was there before her, answering quite differently. "I think I'll go back to Midian first," it said. "I want to see the place one more time." Cheryl pulled face. "Please don't ask me to go," she said. "I'm not up for another visit." "No problem," Laurie replied. "I'm happy to go alone." Chapter 10. Sun and Shade. The sky was cloudless over Midian, the air effervescent. All the fretfulness she'd felt during her first visit here had disappeared. Though this was still the town where Boone had died, she could not hate it for that. Rather the reverse. She and it were allies, both marked by the man's passing. It was not the town itself she'd come to visit, however. It was the graveyard, and it did not disappoint her. The sun gleamed on the mausoleums, the sharp shadows flattering their elaborate decor. Even the grass that sprouted between the tombs was a more brilliant green today. There was no wind from any quarter, no breath of the dream storms bringing the dead. Within the high walls there was an extraordinary stillness, as if the outside world no longer existed. Here was a place sacred to the dead, who were not the living ceased, but almost another species, requiring rites and prayers that belonged uniquely to them. She was surrounded on every side by such signs, epitaphs in English, French, Polish, and Russian, images of veiled women and shattered urns, saints whose martyrdom she could only guess at, stone dogs sleeping upon their masters' tombs, all the symbolism that accompanied this other people. And the more she explored, the more she found herself asking the question she'd posed the day before. Why was the cemetery so big? And why, as became apparent the more tombs she studied, were there so many nationalities laid here? She thought of her dream, of the wind that had come from all quarters of the earth. It was as if there'd been something prophetic in it. The thought didn't worry her. If that was the way the world worked, by omens and prophecies, then it was at least a system, and she had lived too long without one. Love had failed her. Perhaps this would not. It took her an hour, wandering down the hushed avenues, to reach the back wall of the cemetery, against which she found a row of animal graves, cats interred beside birds, dogs beside cats, at peace with each other as common clay. It was an odd sight. Though she knew of other animal cemeteries, she'd never heard of pets being laid in the same consecrated ground as their owners. But then, should she be surprised at anything here? The place was a law unto itself, built far from any who would care or condemn. Turning from the back wall, she could see no sign of the front gate, nor could she remember which of the avenues led back there. It didn't matter. She felt secure in the emptiness of the place, and there was a good deal she wanted to see. Sepulchres whose architecture, towering over its fellows, invited admiration. Choosing a route that would take in half a dozen of the most promising, she began an idling return journey. The sun was warmer by the minute now as it climbed toward noon. Though her pace was slow, she broke out into a sweat, and her throat became steadily drier. It would be no short drive to find somewhere to quench her thirst, but parched throat or no, she didn't hurry. She knew she'd never come here again. She intended to leave with her memories well stocked. Along the way were several tombs that had been virtually overtaken by saplings planted in front of them. Evergreens mostly, reminders of the life eternal, the trees flourished in the seclusion of the walls, fed well on rich soil. In some cases, their spreading roots had cracked the very memorials they'd been planted to offer shade and protection. These scenes of verdancy and ruin she found particularly poignant. She was lingering at one when the perfect silence was broken. Hidden in the foliage, somebody or something was panting. She automatically stepped out of the tree's shadow and into the hot sun. Shock made her heart beat furiously, its thump deafening her to the sound that had excited it. She had to wait for a few moments and listen hard to be sure she'd not imagined the sound. There was no error. Something was in hiding beneath the branches of the tree, which were so weighed by their burden of leaves they almost touched the ground. The sound, now that she listened more carefully, was not human, nor was it healthy. Its roughness and raggedness suggested a dying animal. She stood in the heat of the sun for a minute or more, just staring into the mass of foliage and shadow, trying to catch some sight of the creature. Occasionally there was a movement, a body vainly trying to right itself, a desperate pawing at the ground as the creature tried to rise. Its helplessness touched her. If she failed to do what she could for it, the animal would certainly perish, knowing this was the thought that moved her to action, that someone had heard its agony and passed it by. She stepped back into the shadow. For a moment, the panting stopped completely. Perhaps the creature was fearful of her and, reading her approach as aggression, preparing some final act of defense. Readying herself to retreat before claws and teeth, she parted the outer twigs and peered through the mesh of branches. Her first impression was not one of sight or sound, but of smell. A bittersweet scent that was not unpleasant, its source the pale flanked creature she now made out in the murk, gazing at her wide-eyed. It was a young animal, she guessed, but of no species she could name. A wildcat of some kind, perhaps, but the skin resembled deer hide rather than fur. It watched her warily, its neck barely able to support the weight of its delicately marked head. Even as she returned its gaze, it seemed to give up on life. Its eyes closed, and its head sank to the ground. The resilience of the branches defied any further approach. Rather than attempting to bend them aside, she began to break them in order to get to the failing creature. They were living wood and fought back. Halfway through the thicket, a particularly truculent branch snapped back in her face with such stinging force it brought a shout of pain from her. She put her hand to her cheek. The skin to the right of her mouth was broken. Dabbing the blood away, she attacked the branch with fresh vigor, at last coming within reach of the animal. It was almost beyond responding to her touch, its eyes momentarily fluttering open as she stroked its flank, then closing again. There was no sign that she could see of a wound, but the body beneath her hand was feverish and full of tremors. As she struggled to pick the animal up, it began to urinate, wetting her hands and blouse. But she drew it to her nevertheless, a dead weight in her arms. Beyond the spasms that ran through its nervous system, there was no power left in its muscles. Its limbs hung limply, its head the same. Only the smell she'd first encountered had any strength, intensifying as the creature's final moments approached. Something like a sob reached her ears. She froze. Again, the sound. Off to her left some way and barely suppressed. She stepped back out of the shadow of the tree, bringing the dying animal with her. As the sunlight fell on the creature, it responded with a violence that utterly belied its apparent frailty, its limbs jerking madly. She stepped back into the shade, instinct telling her the brightness was responsible. Only then did she look again in the direction from which the sob had come. The door of one of the mausoleums farther down the avenue, a massive structure of cracked marble, stood ajar, and in the column of darkness beyond she could vaguely make out a human figure. Vaguely, because it was dressed in black and seemed to be veiled. She could make no sense of this scenario. The dying animal tormented by light, the sobbing woman, surely a woman, in the doorway, dressed for mourning. "Who are you?" she called out. The mourner seemed to shrink back into the shadows as she was addressed, then regretted the move and approached the open door again. But so very tentatively, the connection between animal and woman became clear. She's afraid of the sun too, Laurie thought. They belonged together, animal and mourner, the woman sobbing for the creature Laurie had in her arms. She looked at the pavement that lay between where she stood and the mausoleum. Could she get to the door of the tomb without having to step back into the sun and so hasten the creature's demise? Perhaps, with care. Planning her route before she moved, she started to cross toward the mausoleum, using the shadows like stepping stones. She didn't look up at the door. Her attention was wholly focused on keeping the animal from the light. But she could feel the mourner's presence willing her on. Once the woman gave voice, not with a word, but with a soft sound, a cradle-side sound, addressed not to Laurie, but to the dying animal. With the mausoleum door 3 or 4 yards from her, Laurie dared to look up. The woman in the door could be patient no longer. She reached out from her refuge, her arms bared as the garment she wore rode back, her flesh exposed to the sunlight. The skin was white, as ice, as paper, but only for an instant. As the fingers stretched to relieve Laurie of her burden, they darkened and swelled as though instantly bruised. The mourner made a cry of pain and almost fell back into the tomb as she withdrew her arms, but not before the skin broke and trails of dust, yellowish like pollen, burst from her fingers and fell through the sunlight onto the patio. Seconds later, Laurie was at the door, then through it into the safety of the darkness beyond. The room was no more than an antechamber. 2 doors led from it, one into a chapel of some sort, the other below ground. The woman in mourning was standing at this second door, which was open, as far from the wounding light as she could get. In her haste, her veil had fallen. The face beneath was fine-boned and thin, almost to the point of being wasted, lending additional force to her eyes, which caught, even in the darkest corner of the room, some trace of light from the open door, so that they seemed almost to glow. Laurie felt no trace of fear. It was the other woman who trembled as she nursed her sun-struck hands. her gaze moving from Laurie's bewildered face to the animal. "I'm afraid it's dead," Laurie said, not knowing what disease afflicted this woman, but recognizing her grief from all too recent memory. "No," the woman said with quiet conviction. "She can't die." Her words were statement, not entreaty, but the stillness in Laurie's arms contradicted such certainty. If the creature wasn't yet dead, it was surely beyond recall. "Will you bring her to me?" the woman asked. Laurie hesitated, though the weight of the body was making her arms ache, and she wanted the duty done. She didn't want to cross the chamber. "Please," the woman said, reaching out with wounded hands. Relenting, Laurie left the comfort of the door and the sunlit patio beyond. She'd taken only 2 or 3 steps, however, when she heard the sound of whispering. There could only be one source: the stairs. There were people in the crypt. She stopped walking, childhood superstitions rising up in her. Fear of tombs, fear of stairs descending, fear of the underworld. "It's nobody," the woman said, her face pained. "Please, bring me Babette." As if to further reassure Laurie, she took a step away from the stairs, murmuring to the animal she'd called Babette. Either the words or the woman's proximity, or perhaps the cool darkness of the chamber, won a response from the creature. A tremor ran down its spine like an electrical charge, so strong Laurie almost lost hold of it. The woman's murmurs grew louder, as if she were chiding the dying thing, her anxiety to claim it suddenly urgent. But there was an impasse. Laurie was no more willing to approach the entrance to the crypt than the woman was to come another step toward the outer door. And in the seconds of stasis, the animal found new life. One of its claws seized Laurie's breast as it began to writhe in her embrace. The chiding became a shout. "Babette!" But if the creature heard, it didn't care to listen. Its motion became more violent, a mingling of fit and sensuality. One moment it shuddered as though tortured. The next it moved like a snake sloughing off its skin. "Don't look! Don't look!" she heard the woman say. But Laurie wasn't about to take her eyes off this horrendous dance, nor could she give the creature over to the woman's charge. While the claw gripped her so tightly, any attempt to separate them would draw blood. But that "don't look" had purpose. Now it was Laurie's turn to raise her voice in panic, as she realized that what was taking place in her arms defied all reason. "Jesus God!" The animal was changing before her eyes. In the luxury of slough and spasm, it was losing its bestiality, not by reordering its anatomy, but by liquefying its whole self, through to the bone, until what had been solid was a tumble of matter. Here was the origin of the bittersweet scent she'd met beneath the tree, the stuff of the beast's dissolution. In the moment it lost its coherence, the matter was ready to be out of her grasp. But somehow the essence of the thing, its will, perhaps its soul, drew it back for the business of remaking. The last part of the beast to melt was the claw, its disintegration sending a throb of pleasure through Laurie's body. It did not distract her from the fact that she was released. Horrified, she couldn't get what she held from her embrace fast enough, tipping it into the mourner's outstretched arms like so much excrement. "Jesus," she said, backing away. "Jesus, Jesus." There was no horror on the woman's face, however, only joy. Tears of welcome rolled down her pale cheeks and fell into the melting pot she held. Laurie looked away toward the sunlight. After the gloom of the interior, it was blinding. She was momentarily disoriented and closed her eyes to allow herself a reprieve from both tomb and light. It was sobbing that made her open her eyes. Not the woman this time, but a child, a girl of 4 or 5, lying naked where the muck of transformation had been. "Babette," the woman said. "Impossible," reason replied. This thin white child could not be the animal she'd rescued from beneath the tree. It was sleight of hand or some idiot delusion she'd foisted upon herself. Impossible, all impossible. "She likes to play outside," the woman was saying, looking up from the child at Lori. And I tell her, never, never in the sun. Never play in the sun. But she's a child. She doesn't understand. Impossible, reason repeated. But somewhere in her gut, Lori had already given up trying to deny. The animal had been real. The transformation had been real. Now here was a living child, weeping in her mother's arms. She too was real. Every moment she wasted saying no to what she knew was a moment lost to comprehension. That her worldview couldn't contain such a mystery without shattering was its liability and a problem for another day. For now she simply wanted to be away, into the sunlight where she knew these shapeshifters feared to follow. Not daring to take her eyes off them until she was in the sun, she reached out to the wall to guide her tentative backward steps. But Babette's mother wanted to hold her a while longer. I owe you something, she said. No, Lori replied. I don't want anything from you. She felt the urge to express her revulsion, but the scene of reunion before her, the child reaching up to touch her mother's chin, her sobs passing, was so tender. Disgust became bewilderment, fear, confusion. Let me help you, the woman said. I know why you came here. I doubt it, Lori said. Don't waste your time here, the woman replied. There's nothing for you here. Midian's a home for the night breed. Only the night breed. Her voice had dropped in volume. It was barely above a whisper. The night breed, Lori said more loudly. The woman looked pained. Shh, she said. I shouldn't be telling you this, but I owe you this much at least. Lori had stopped her retreat to the door. Her instinct was telling her to wait. Do you know a man called Boone? She said. The woman opened her mouth to reply, her face a mass of contrary feelings. She wanted to answer, that much was clear, but fear prevented her from speaking. It didn't matter. Her hesitation was answer enough. She did know Boone, or had. Rachel. A voice rose from the door that led down into the earth, a man's voice. Come away, it demanded. You've nothing to tell. The woman looked toward the stairs. Mr. Lylesburg, she said, her tone formal. She saved a bet. We know, came the reply from the darkness. We saw. Still, you must come away. We, Lori thought. How many others were there below ground? How many more of the night breed? Taking confidence from the proximity of the open door, she challenged the voice that was attempting to silence her informant. I saved the child, she said. I think I deserve something for that. There was a silence from the darkness, then a point of heated ash brightened in its midst, and Lori realized that Mr. Lylesburg was standing almost at the top of the stairs, where the light from outside should have illuminated him, albeit poorly, but that somehow the shadows were clotted about him, leaving him invisible but for his cigarette. The child has no life to save, he said to Lori, but what she has is yours if you want it. He paused. Do you want it? If you do, take her. She belongs to you. The notion of this exchange horrified her. What do you take me for? She said. I don't know, Lylesburg replied. You were the one who demanded recompense. I just want some questions answered, Lori protested. I don't want the child. I'm not a savage. No, the voice said softly. No, you're not. So go. You've no business here. He drew on the cigarette, and by its tiny light, Lori glimpsed the speaker's features. She sensed that he willingly revealed himself in this moment, dropping the veil of shadow for a handful of instants to meet her gaze face to face. He, like Rachel, was wasted, his gauntness more acute because his bones were large and made for solid cladding. Now, with his eyes sunk into their sockets, and the muscles of his face all too plain beneath papery skin, It was the sweep of his brow that dominated, furrowed and sickly. "This was never intended," he said. "You weren't meant to see." "I know that," Laurie replied. "Then you also know that to speak of this will bring dire consequences." "Don't threaten me." "Not for you," Lylesburg said. "For us." She felt a twinge of shame at her misunderstanding. She wasn't the vulnerable one, she who could walk in the sunlight. "I won't say anything," she told him. "I thank you," he said. He drew on his cigarette again, and the dark smoke took his face from view. "What's below," he said from behind the veil, "remains below." Rachel sighed softly at this, gazing down at the child as she rocked it gently. "Come away," Lylesburg told her, and the shadows that concealed him moved off down the stairs. "I have to go," Rachel said, and turned to follow. "Forget you were ever here. There's nothing you can do. You heard Mr. Lylesburg. What's below remains below. Yes, I heard. Midian's for the breed. There's no one here who needs you. Just tell me," Laurie requested. "Is Boone here?" Rachel was already at the top of the stairs and now began to descend. "He is, isn't he?" Laurie said, forsaking the safety of the open door and crossing the chamber toward Rachel. "You people stole the body." It made some terrible, macabre sense. Those tomb dwellers, this night breed, keeping Boone from being laid to rest. "You did. You stole him." Rachel paused and looked back up at Laurie, her face barely visible in the blackness of the stairs. "We stole nothing," she said, her reply without rancor. "So where is he?" Laurie demanded. Rachel turned away, and the shadows took her completely from view. "Tell me, please, God," Laurie yelled down after her. Suddenly she was crying in a turmoil of rage and fear and frustration. "Tell me, please." Desperation carried her down the stairs after Rachel, her shouts becoming appeals. "Wait, talk to me." She took 3 steps, then a 4th. On the 5th, she stopped, or rather her body stopped, the muscles of her legs becoming rigid without her instruction, refusing to carry her another step into the darkness of the crypt. Her skin was suddenly crawling with goose flesh, her pulse thumping in her ears. No force of will could overrule the animal imperative forbidding her to descend. All she could do was stand rooted to the spot and stare into the depths. Even her tears had suddenly dried and the saliva gone from her mouth, so she could no more speak than walk. Not that she wanted to call down into the darkness now, for fear the forces there would answer her summons. Though she could see nothing of them, her gut knew they were more terrible by far than Rachel and her beast child. Shape-shifting was almost a natural act beside the skills these others had to hand. She felt their perversity as a quality of the air. She breathed it in and out. It scoured her lungs and hurried her heart. If they had Boone's corpse as a plaything, it was beyond reclamation. She would have to take comfort from the hope that his spirit was somewhere brighter. Defeated, she took a step backward. The shadows seemed unwilling to relinquish her, however. She felt them weave themselves into her blouse and hook themselves on her eyelashes, 1,000 tiny holds upon her, slowing her retreat. "I won't tell anyone," she murmured. "Please let me go." But the shadows held on, their power a promise of retribution if she defied them. "I promise," she said. "What more can I do?" And suddenly they capitulated. She hadn't realized how strong their claim was until it was withdrawn. She stumbled backward, falling up the stairs into the light of the antechamber. Turning her back on the crypt, she fled for the door and out into the sun. It was too bright. She covered her eyes, holding herself upright by gripping the stone portico so that she could accustom herself to its violence. It took several minutes, standing against the mausoleum, shaking and rigid by turn. Only when she felt able to see through half-closed eyes did she attempt to walk. Her route back to the main gate a farrago of cul-de-sacs and missed turnings. By the time she reached it, however, she'd more or less accustomed herself to the brutality of light and sky. Her body was still not back at her mind's disposal, however. Her legs refused to carry her more than a few paces up the hill to Midian without threatening to drop her to the ground. Her system, overdosed on adrenaline, was cavorting, but at least she was alive. For a short while there on the stairs, it had been touch and go. The shadows that had held her by lash and thread could have taken her, she had no doubt of that, claimed her for the underworld, and snuffed her out. Why had they released her? Perhaps because she'd saved the child. Perhaps because she'd sworn silence and they'd trusted her. Neither, however, seemed the motives of monsters, and she had to believe that what lived beneath Midian's cemetery deserved that name. Who other than monsters made their nests among the dead? They might call themselves the night breed, but neither words nor gestures of good faith could disguise their true nature. She had escaped demons, things of rot and wickedness, and she would have offered up a prayer of thanks for her deliverance if the sky had not been so wide and bright, and so plainly devoid of deities to hear. Part 3. Dark Ages. Out on the town, with two skins, the leather and the flesh, 3 if you count the 4, all out to be touched tonight, yes sir, all ready to be rubbed and nuzzled and loved tonight, yes sir. Charles Kidd, hanging by a thread. Chapter 11. The Stalking Ground. 1. Driving back to Sheerneck, the radio turned up to a deafening level, both to confirm her existence and keep it from straying. She became more certain by the mile that, promises notwithstanding, she'd not be able to conceal the experience from Cheryl. How could it not be obvious in her face, in her voice? Such fears proved groundless. Either she was better at concealment than she thought, or Cheryl was more insensitive. Either way, Cheryl asked only the most perfunctory questions about Laurie's return visit to Midian before moving on to talk of Curtis. I want you to meet him, she said, just to be sure I'm not dreaming. I'm going to go home, Cheryl, Laurie said. Not tonight, surely, it's too late. She was right. The day was too advanced for Laurie to contemplate a homeward trip, nor could she fabricate a reason for denying Cheryl's request without offending. You won't feel like a lemon, I promise, Cheryl said. He said he wanted to meet you. I told him all about you. Well, not all, but enough, about how we met. She made a forlorn face. Say you'll come, she said. I'll come. Fabulous. I'll call him right now. While Cheryl went about making her call, Laurie took a shower. There was news of the night's arrangements within 2 minutes. He'll meet us at this restaurant he knows around 8, Cheryl hollered. He'll even find a friend for you. No, Cheryl. I think he was just kidding, came the reply. Cheryl appeared at the bathroom door. He's got a funny sense of humor, she said. When you're not sure if someone's making a joke or not, he's like that. Great, Laurie thought. A failed comedian. But there was something undeniably comforting about coming back to Cheryl and this girlish passion. Her endless talk of Curtis, none of which gave Laurie more than a street artist's portrait of the man, all surface and no insight, was the perfect distraction from thoughts of Midian and its revelations. The early evening was so filled with good humor and the ritual of preparing for a night on the town that on occasion Laurie found herself wondering if all that had happened in the necropolis had not been a hallucination. But she had evidence that confirmed the memory, the cut beside her mouth from that wayward branch. It was little enough sign, but the sharp hurt of it kept her from doubting her sanity. She had been to Midian. She had held the shapeshifter in her arms and stood on the crypt stairs, gazing into a miasma so profound it could have rotted the faith of a saint. Though the unholy world beneath the cemetery was as far from Cheryl and her whirlwind romance as night from day, it was no less real for that. In time, she would have to address that reality, find a place for it, though it defied all logic. For now, she would keep it in mind, with the cut as its guardian, and enjoy the pleasures of the evening ahead. 2. "It's a joke," said Cheryl as they stood outside the Hudson Bay sunset. "Didn't I tell you he had this weird sense of humor?" The restaurant he'd named had been completely gutted by fire several weeks ago, to judge by the state of the timbers. "Are you sure you got the right address?" Laurie asked. Cheryl laughed. "I tell you, it's one of his jokes," she said. "So we've laughed," said Laurie. "When do we get to eat?" "He's probably watching us," Cheryl said, her good humor slightly forced. Laurie looked around for some sign of the voyeur. Though there was nothing to fear on the streets of a town like this, even on a Saturday night, the neighborhood was far from welcoming. Every other shop along the block was closed up, and the sidewalks completely deserted in both directions. It was no place they wanted to linger. "I don't see him," Laurie said. "Neither do I." "So what do we do now?" Laurie asked, doing her best to keep any trace of irritation from her voice. If this was Curtis the Beau's idea of a good time, Cheryl's taste had to be in doubt. But then who was she to judge, who'd loved and lost a psycho? "He's got to be here somewhere," Cheryl said hopefully. "Curtis?" she called out, pushing open the heat-blistered door. "Why don't we wait for him out here, Cheryl?" "He's probably inside. The place could be dangerous." Her appeal was ignored. "Cheryl, I hear you. I'm okay." She was already immersed in the darkness of the interior. The smell of burned wood and fabric stung Laurie's nostrils. "Curtis," she heard Cheryl call. A car went past, its engine badly tuned. The passenger, a youth, prematurely balding, leaned out of the window. "Need any help?" "No, thanks," Laurie yelled back, not certain if the question was small-town courtesy or a come-on. Probably the latter, she decided, as the car picked up speed and disappeared. People were the same all over. Her mood, which had improved by leaps and bounds since she'd been back in Cheryl's company, was rapidly souring. She didn't like being on this empty street, with what little was left of the day sliding toward extinction. The night, which had always been a place of promise, belonged too much to the breed, who had taken its name for themselves. And why not? All darkness was one darkness in the end. Of heart or heavens, one darkness. Even now, in Midian, they'd be dragging back the doors of the mausoleums, knowing that the starlight would not wither them. She shuddered at the thought. Off down one of the streets, she heard the car engine rev up and roar, then a squeal of brakes. Were the Good Samaritans coming around for a second look? "Cheryl," she called out, "where are you?" The joke, if joke it had been and not Cheryl's error, had long since lost what questionable humor it had. She wanted to get back into the car and drive, back to the hotel if necessary. "Cheryl, are you there?" There was laughter from the interior of the building, Cheryl's gurgling laughter. Suspecting now her compliance in this fiasco, Laurie stepped through the door in search of the tricksters. The laughter came again, then broke off as Cheryl said, "Curtis," in a tone of mock indignation that decayed into further inane laughter. So the great lover was here. Laurie half contemplated returning to the street, getting back into the car and leaving them to their damn fool games. But the thought of the evening alone in the hotel room, listening to more partying, spurred her on through an assault course of burned furniture. Had it not been for the brightness of floor tiles throwing the street light up toward the cage of ceiling beams, she might not have risked advancing far. But ahead she could dimly see the archway through which Cheryl's laughter had floated. She made her way toward it. All sound had ceased. They were watching her every tentative step. She felt their scrutiny. "Come on, guys," she said. "Joke's over. I'm hungry." There was no reply. Behind her on the street, she heard the Samaritans yelling. Retreat was not advisable. She advanced, stepping through the archway. Her first thought was, he only told half a lie. This was a restaurant. The exploration had taken her into a kitchen, where probably the fire had started. It, too, was tiled in white, surfaces smoke-stained, but still bright enough to lend the whole interior, which was large, an odd luminescence. She stood in the doorway and scanned the room. The largest of the stoves was placed in the center, racks of shining utensils still hanging above it, truncating her view. The jokers had to be in hiding on the other side of the range. It was the only refuge the room offered. Despite her anxieties, she felt an echo here of remembered games of hide and seek. The first game, because the simplest. How she'd love to be terrorized by her father, chased and caught. If only he were here in hiding now, she found herself thinking, waiting to embrace her. But cancer had long since caught him by the throat. "Cheryl," she said, "I give up. Where are you?" Even as she spoke, her advance brought her within sight of one of the players, and the game ended. Cheryl was not in hiding, unless death was hiding. She was crouched against the stove, the darkness around her too wet for shadow, her head thrown back, her face slashed open. Jesus God. Behind Laurie, a sound. Somebody coming to find her, too late to hide. She'd be caught. And not by loving arms, not by her father playing the monster. This was the monster itself. She turned to see its face before it took her. But running at her was a sewing box doll. Zipper for mouth, buttons for eyes, all sewn on white linen and tied around the monster's face so tightly, his saliva darkened a patch around his mouth. She was denied the face, but not the teeth. He held them above his head, gleaming knives, their blades fine as grass stalks, sweeping down to stab out her eyes. She threw herself out of their reach, but he was after her in an instant, the mouth behind the zipper calling her name. "Better get it over with, Laurie." The blades were coming at her again, but she was quicker. The mask didn't seem too hurried. He closed on her with a steady step, his confidence obscene. "Cheryl had the right idea," he said. "She just stood there and let it happen. Fuck you. Later, maybe." He ran one of the blades along the row of hanging pots, striking squeals and sparks. "Later, when you're a little colder," he laughed, his zipper gaping. "There's something to look forward to." She let him talk while trying to get some sense of what escape routes lay open to her. The fire door was blocked by burning timbers. Her only exit was the arch through which she'd entered, and the mask stood between her and it, sharpening his teeth on each other. He started toward her again. No jibes from him now. The time for talk was over. As he closed on her, she thought of Midian. Surely she'd not survived its terrors to be hacked to death by some lone psycho. Fuck him. As the knife slid toward her, she snatched a pot from the rack above the range and brought it up to meet his face. It connected squarely. Her strength stopped her. The mask reeled, dropping one of his blades. There was no sound from behind the linen, however. He merely transferred the remaining blade from right hand to left, shook his head as if to stop its singing, and came at her again at a rush. She barely had time to raise the pan in defense. The blade slid down it and met her hand. For a moment, there was no pain, nor even blood. Then both came in profusion, the pan falling from her hand at her feet. Now he made a sound, a cooing sound, the tilt of his head suggesting that it was the blood he was staring at as it ran from the wound he'd fathered. She looked toward the door, calculating the time it would take to get there against his speed of pursuit. But before she could act, the mask began his last advance. The knife was not raised, nor was his voice when he spoke. "Laurie," he said, "we must talk, you and me. Keep the fuck away." To her amazement, he obeyed the instructions. She seized what little time this offered to claim his other blade from the floor. She was less competent with her unwounded hand, but he was a large target. She could do him damage, preferably through the heart. "That's what I killed Cheryl with," he said. "I'd put it down if I were you." The steel was sticky in her palm. "Yes, that slit little Cheryl, ear to ear," he went on. "And now you've got your prints all over it. You should have worn gloves, like me." The thought of what the blade had done appalled her, but she wasn't about to drop it and stand unarmed. Of course, you could always blame Boone, the mask was saying. Tell the police he did it. How do you know about Boone, she said. Hadn't Cheryl sworn she told her paramour nothing? You know where he is, the mask stated. He's dead, she replied. The sewing box face denied it with a shake. No, I'm afraid not. He got up and walked. God knows how, but he got up and walked. Can you imagine that? The man was pumped full of bullets. You saw the blood he shed. He was watching us all the time, she thought. He followed us to Midian that first day. But why? That was what she couldn't make sense of. Why? All that blood, all those bullets, and still he wouldn't lie down dead. Somebody stole the body, she said. No, came the reply. That's not the way it was. Who the hell are you? Good question. No reason why you shouldn't have an answer. His hand went up to his face and he pulled off the mask. Beneath was Decker, sweaty and smiling. I wish I'd brought my camera, he said. The look on your face. The shock made her gape like a fish. Decker was Curtis, Cheryl's Mr. Right. Why? She demanded. Why what? Why did you kill Cheryl? For the same reason I killed all the others, he said lightly, as though the question hadn't much vexed him. Then, deadly serious. For the fun of it, of course. For the pleasure. We used to talk a lot about why, Boone and me. Digging deep, you know, trying to understand. But when it really comes down to it, I do it because I like it. Boone was innocent. Is innocent. Wherever he's hiding. Which is a problem because he knows the real facts. And one of these days, he might find someone to convince of the truth. So you want to stop him? Wouldn't you? All the trouble I went to so he could die a guilty man. I even put a bullet into myself, and he still gets up and walks away. He told me he was dead. They were certain. The mortuary was unlocked from the inside. Did they tell you that? His fingerprints were on the handle, his footprints on the door. Did they tell you that? No, of course not. But I'm telling you, I know. Boone is alive, and your death is going to bring him out of hiding. I'll bet on it. He'll have to show himself. Slowly, as he spoke, he was raising the knife. If it's only to mourn. Suddenly, he was at her. She put the blade that had killed Cheryl between her and his approach. It slowed him, but he didn't stop coming. Could you really do it? He said to her. I don't think so. And I speak from experience. People are squeamish even when their lives are at stake. And that knife, of course, it's already been blunted on poor Cheryl. You'll have to really dig to make some impression on me. He spoke almost playfully, still advancing. I'd like to see you try, though, he said. I really would like to see you try. Out of the corner of her eye, she was aware that she'd come abreast of piled plates mere inches from her elbow. Might they offer her time enough to get to the door? She wondered. In knife-to-knife combat with this maniac, she'd lose, no doubt of it. But she might yet outwit him. Come on, try me. Kill me if you can. For Boone. For poor, mad Boone. As the words became laughter, she threw her wounded hand out toward the plates, hooked them round, and flung them onto the floor in front of Decker. A second pile followed, and a third, china shards flying up in all directions. He took a step back, his hands going up to his face to protect him. Took the chance while he had it, bolting. She got through it and into the restaurant itself before she heard his pursuit. By that time, she had sufficient lead to reach the outer door and fling herself through it onto the street. Once on the sidewalk, she immediately turned and faced the door through which he would come. But he had no intention of following her into the light. Clever bitch, he said from the darkness. I'll get you. When I've got Boone, I'll come back for you. You just count the breaths till then. Eyes still fixed on the door, she backed off down the sidewalk toward the car. Only now did she realize that she still carried the murder weapon, her grip so strong, almost glued to it. She had no choice but to take it with her and give it and her evidence to the police. Back to the car, she opened the door and only looking away. The locks were through the night onto the floor in front of the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove. 3. The choice before her came down to this: the police or Midian, a night of interrogation or a return to the necropolis. If she chose the former, she would not be able to warn Boone of Decker's pursuit. But then suppose Decker had been lying and Boone had not survived the bullets. She'd not only be fleeing from the scene of a murder, but putting herself within reach of the night breeders, and uselessly. Yesterday she would have chosen to go to the law. She would have trusted that its procedures would make all these mysteries come clear, that they would believe her story and bring Decker to justice. But yesterday she thought beasts were beasts, and she thought that only lived in the earth, and that they were peaceless. She thought doctors healed, and that when the madman's mask was raised, she would say, "But of course, that's a madman's face." All wrong. All so wrong. Yesterday's assumptions were gone to the wind. Anything might be true. Boone might be alive. She drove to Midian. Chapter 12. Above and Below. 1. Trains came to meet her down the highway, by the after effects of shock and the loss of blood from her bound but wounded hand. They began like snow blown toward the windshield, flakes of brightness that defied the glass and flew past her, whining as they went. As her dreamy state worsened, she seemed to see faces flying at her, and commas of light like fetuses, which whispered as they tumbled past. The spectacle did not distress her, quite the reverse. It seemed to confirm a scenario her hallucinating mind had created, that she, like Boone, was living a charmed life. Nothing could harm her, not tonight, though her cut hand was now so numb it could no longer grip the wheel, leaving her to navigate an unlit road one-handed and at speed. Fate had not let her survive Decker's attack, only to kill her on the highway. That was why the visions came, racing into the headlights and skipping over the car to burst above her and shine lights. They were welcoming her to Midian. 2. Once she looked in the mirror and thought she glimpsed a car behind her, its lights turned off. But when she looked again, it had gone. Perhaps it had never been there. Ahead lay the town, its houses blinded by her headlights. She drove down the main street all the way to the graveyard gates. The mingled intoxications of blood loss and exhaustion had dulled all fear of this place. If she could survive the malice of the living, she could surely survive the dead, or their companions. And Boone was here. That hope had hardened into certainty as she drove. Boone was here, and finally she'd be able to take him into her arms. She stumbled out of the car and almost fell flat on her face. Get up, she told herself. The lights were still coming at her, though she was no longer moving. But now all trace of detail in them had vanished. There was only the brightness, its ferocity threatening to wash the whole world away. Knowing total collapse was imminent, she crossed to the gates, calling Boone's name. She had an answer immediately, though not the one she sought. "He's here," somebody said. "Boone is here." Clinging to the gate, she turned her leaden head, and through the surf of light saw Decker, standing a few yards from her, his lightless car. Even in her dizzied state, she understood how she'd been manipulated. Decker had allowed her to escape, knowing she'd seek out his enemy. Stupid, she told herself. Well, yes, but then what were you to do? No doubt you thought you might save him. She had neither the strength nor the wit to resist the man. Relinquishing the support of the gates, she staggered into the cemetery. "Boone!" she yelled. "Boone!" Decker didn't come after her quickly. He had no need. She was a wounded animal going in search of another wounded animal. Glancing behind her, she saw him checking his gun by the light of his headlights. Then he pushed the gate wider and came in pursuit. She could barely see the avenues in front of her for the bursts of light in her head. She was like a blind woman, sobbing as she stumbled, no longer even certain if Decker was behind her or in front. Any moment he would dispatch her. One bullet, and her charmed life would end. 3. In the ground below, the breed heard her arrival, their senses attuned to panic and despair. They knew the hunter's tread, too. They'd heard it behind them all too often. Now they waited, pitying the woman in her last moments, but too covetous of their refuge to put it at risk. There were few enough hiding places left where the monstrous might find peace. They'd not endanger their hermitage for a human life. Still, it pained them, hearing her pleas and her calls, and for one of their number, the sound was almost beyond endurance. Let me go to her. You can't. You know you can't. I can kill him. Who's to know he was ever here? He won't be alone. There will be others waiting outside the walls. Remember how they came for you? I can't let her die. Boone, please, God. It was worse than anything he'd suffered. Hearing her calling him and knowing Midian's law wouldn't let him answer. Listen to her, for God's sake, he said. Listen. You made promises when we took you in, Lylesburg reminded him. I know. I understand. I wonder if you do. They weren't demanded lightly, Boone. Break them and you belong nowhere. Not with us, not with them. You're asking me to listen to her die. So block your ears. It'll soon be over. 4. She could no longer find the breath to call his name. No matter, he wasn't here. Or if he was dead in the earth and corrupted, beyond help in the giving or the taking. She was alone, and the man with the gun was closing on her. Decker took the mask from his pocket, the button mask he felt so safe behind. Oh, the number of times in those tiresome days with Boone, teaching him the dates and the places of the murders he was inheriting, when Decker's pride had almost brimmed over and he'd itched to reclaim the crimes. But he needed the scapegoat more than the quick thrill of confession to keep suspicion at bay. Boone's admitting to the crimes wouldn't have been an end to it all, of course. In time, the mask would start speaking to its owner again, demanding to be bloodied, and the killings would have to begin afresh. But not until Decker had found himself another name and another city to set up his store in. Boone had spoiled those well-laid plans, but he'd get no chance to tell what he knew. Old Buttonface would see to that. Decker pulled the mask on. It smelled of his excitement. As soon as he breathed in, he got a hard. Not the little sex hard, but the death hard, the murder hard. It sniffed the air for him, even through the thickness of his trousers and underwear. It smelled the victim that ran ahead of him. The mask didn't care that his prey was female. He got the murder hard for anyone. In his time, he'd had a heat for old men, pissing their pants as they went down in front of him. For girls sometimes women, even children. Old Buttonface looked with the same cross-threaded eyes on the whole of humanity. This one, this woman in the dark up ahead, meant no more to the mask than any of the others. Once they started to panic and bleed, they were all the same. He followed her with steady step. That was one of Buttonhead's trademarks, the executioner's tread. And she fled before him, her pleas deteriorating into snot and gasps. Though she hadn't got breath to call for her hero, no doubt she prayed he'd still come for her. Poor bitch. Didn't she know they never showed? He'd heard them all called upon in his time, begged for, bargained with, the holy fathers and mothers, the champions, the interceders. None of them ever showed. But her agony would be over soon. A shot through the back of the head to bring her down, and then he'd take the big knife, the heavy knife, to her face, the way he did with all of them. Crisscross, crisscross, like the threads in his eye, till there was nothing left to look at but meat. Ah, she was falling, too tired to run any farther. He opened old Buttonhead's steel mouth and spoke to the fallen girl. Be still, he said. It's quicker that way. She tried to get up one final time, but her legs had given out completely, and the wash of whiteness was practically all-consuming. Giddily, She turned her head in the direction of Decker's voice, and in a trough between the white waves, she saw that he'd put his mask back on. Its face was at Death's head. He raised the gun. In the ground beneath her, she felt tremors. Was it the sound of a shot, perhaps? She couldn't see the gun any longer, or even Decker. One final wave had washed him from sight. But her body felt the earth rock, and through the whine in her head, she heard somebody calling the name of the man she'd hoped to find here. Boone. She didn't hear an answer. Perhaps there wasn't one, but the call came again, as if summoning him back into the earth. Before she could muster the last of her power to counter the call, her good arm gave out beneath her and she was face down on the ground. Buttonhead walked toward his quarry, disappointed that the woman would not be conscious to hear his final benediction. He liked to offer a few words of insight at the penultimate moment, words he never planned, but that came like poetry from the zipper mouth. On occasion they'd laughed at his sermon, and that had made him cruel. But if they cried, and they often did, then he took it in good part and made certain the last moment, the very last, was swift and painless. He kicked the woman over onto her back to see if he could raise her from her sleep. And yes, her eyes flickered open slightly. Good, he said, pointing the gun at her face. As he felt wisdom coming to his lips, he heard the growl. It drew his gaze off the woman for a moment. A soundless wind had risen from somewhere and was shaking the trees. There was complaint in the ground beneath his feet. The mask was untouched. Wandering in tomb yards didn't raise a hair on his neck. He was the new Death. Tomorrow's face today. What harm could dust do him? He laughed at the melodrama of it, threw back his head and laughed. At his feet, the woman started moaning. Time to shut her up. He took aim at her open mouth. As he recognized the word she was shaping, the dark ahead of him divided, and that word stepped out of hiding. Boone, she'd said. It was. He emerged from the shadow of the shaking trees, dressed just as the mask remembered, in dirty t-shirt and jeans. But there was a brightness in his eyes the mask did not remember, and he, despite the bullets he'd taken, like a man who'd never known an ache in his life. Mystery enough, but there was more. Even as he stepped into view, he began to change, breathing out a veil of smoke that took his flesh for fantasy. This was the scapegoat, yet not. So much not. The mask looked down at the woman to confirm that they shared this vision, but she had fallen into unconsciousness. He had to trust what the cross-sewn eyes told him, and they told him terrors. The sinews of Boone's arms and neck were rippling with light and darkness. His fingers were growing larger. His face, behind the smoke he exhaled, seemed to be running with dazzling filaments that described a hidden form within his head that muscle and bone were conforming to. And out of the confusion, a voice. It was not the voice the mask remembered. No scapegoat's voice hushed with guilt. It was a yell of fury. You're a dead man, Decker, the monster cried. The mask hated that name, that Decker. The man was just some old flame he'd fucked once in a while. In a heat like this, with a murder heart so strong, old Buttonhead could barely remember whether Dr. Decker was alive or dead. Still, the monster called him by that name. You hear me, Decker, he said. Bastard thing, the mask thought. Misbegotten, half-aborted bastard thing. He pointed the gun at his heart. It had finished breathing transformations and stood before its enemy complete, if a thing born on a butcher's slab could be called complete. Mothered by a she-wolf, fathered by a clown, it was ridiculous to a fault. There'd be no benediction for this one, the mask decided, only phlegm on its hybrid face when it was dead on the ground. Without further thought, he fired. The bullet opened a hole in the center of Boone's t-shirt and in the changed flesh beneath, but the creature only grinned. You tried that already, Decker, Boone said. Don't you ever learn? I'm not Decker, the mask replied, and fired again. Another hole opened up beside the first, but no blood came from either. Boone had begun to advance on the gun. No last faltering step, but a steady approach which the mask recognized as his own executioner's tread. He could smell the filth of the beast even through the linen across his face. It was bittersweet and sickened him. "Be still," the monster said. "It's quicker that way." The stolen step was insult enough, but to hear the purity of his own words from that unnatural throat drove the mask to distraction. He shrieked against the cloth and aimed the gun at Boone's mouth. But before he could blow out the offending tongue, Boone's swollen...
Hey, just chilling. How you doing, bro?
Even as it was snatched from him.
Oh, yeah. I have nice little glob of wax on there.
His smallest finger. The expression on his face darkened with displeasure. He dragged the gun out of the mask's hands and flung it away. Then he
hope you're doing well.
And drew
just chilling.
Faced with imminent extinction, the mask and its wearer divided. Old Buttonhead did not believe he could ever die. Decker did. His teeth grated against the cage across his mouth as he began to beg. "Boone,
oh, that one?
You know what you're doing." He felt the mask tighten over his head in fury at his cowardice. But he talked on, trying to find that even tone he had used to calm this man once upon a time. "You're diseased, Boone." "Don't beg," he heard the mask saying. "Don't you dare beg." "And you can heal me, can you?" the monster said. "Oh, yes," Decker replied. "Oh, certainly. Just give me a little time." Boone's wounded hand stroked the mask.
Dr. Dabber.
"Why do you hide behind this thing?" he asked. "It makes me hide. I don't..."
Yeah, it definitely is. It's definitely a...
The mask's fury knew no
excuse me.
bounds. It shrieked.
It definitely
hearing him betray his
rips
master.
pretty good.
If he survived tonight, it would demand the vilest compensation for these lies. He'd pay it gladly tomorrow, but he had to outwit the beast to live that long. "You must feel the same as me," he said, "behind that skin you have to wear." "The same?" said Boone. "Trapped, made to spill blood. You don't want to spill blood any more than I do." "You don't understand," Boone said. "I'm not behind this face. I am this face." Decker shook his head. "I don't think so. I think that somewhere you're still Boone." "Boone is dead."
I'm listening to
down in front of
Cabal.
Remember? You put bullets
it's
in yourself. But you
Clive
survived.
Barker
Not alive.
book.
Decker's bulk had been trembling. Now it stopped. Every muscle in his body became rigid as the explanation for these mysteries came clear. "You drove me into the hands of monsters, Decker, and I became one. Not your kind of monster, not the soulless kind." He drew Decker very close, his face inches from the mask. "I'm dead, Decker."
What do you mean? What's with the dabs?
Midian in my veins.
I'll do one here in a sec. I just got done doing one.
Over and over. But you, the hand stroking the mask, now gripped the fabric. "You, Decker, when you die, you die. And I want to see your face when it happens." Boone pulled at the mask. It was tied on securely and wouldn't come. He had to get his claws into the warp and woof to tear it open and uncover the sweaty facts beneath. How many hours had he spent watching?
I found that online somewhere.
Hanging on its every flicker of approbation. So much.
Just going through random pictures.
This was the healer's true condition.
One second, I'll be right back, and then we'll do a dab.
"I was afraid," Decker said. "You understand that, don't you? They were going to find me, punish me. I needed someone to blame." "You chose the wrong man." "Man?" said a soft voice from the darkness. "You call yourself a man?" Boone stood corrected. "Monster," he said. Laughter followed. Then, "Well, are you going to kill him or not?" Boone looked away from Decker to the speaker squatting on the tomb. His face was a mass of scar tissue. "Does he remember me?" the man asked Boone. "I don't know. Do you?" Boone demanded of Decker. His name's Narcissus. Decker just stared. Another of Midian's tribe, Boone said. I was never quite certain I belonged, Narcissus mused. Not till I was picking the bullets from my face. Kept thinking I was dreaming it all. Afraid, said Boone. I was. You know what they do to natural men. Boone nodded. So kill him, Narcissus said. Eat out his eyes, or I'll do it for you. Not till I get a confession from him. Confession, said Decker, his eyes widening at the thought of reprieve. If that's what you want, say the word. He began rummaging in his jacket as if looking for a pen. What the fuck's the use of a confession? Narcissus said. You think anybody's ever going to forgive you now? Look at yourself. He jumped down off the tomb. Look, he whispered. If Lylesburg knows I came up here, he'll have me out. Just give me his eyes, for old time's sake. Then the rest's yours. Don't let him touch me, Decker begged Boone. Anything you want. Full confession, anything. But keep him off me. Too late. Narcissus was already reaching for him, with or without Boone's permission. Boone attempted to keep him at bay with his free hand, but the man was too eager for revenge to be blocked. He forced himself between Boone and his prey. Look your last, he grinned, raising his hooked thumbs. But Decker's rummaging hadn't been all panic. As the hooks came at his eyes, he drew the big knife out of hiding in his jacket and thrust it into his attacker's belly. He'd made long and sober study of his craft. The cut he gave Narcissus was a disemboweling maneuver learned from the Japanese, deep into the intestines and up toward the navel, drawing the blade two-handed against the weight of meat. Narcissus cried out, more in memory of pain than in pain itself. In one smooth motion, Decker pulled the big knife out, knowing from research in the field that the well-packed contents were bound to follow. He wasn't wrong. Narcissus's gut uncoiled, falling like a flesh apron to its sheath. The wounding, it dropped the living man to the ground on the spot. He made a clown of Narcissus. Howling in disgust at the sight of his innards, he clutched at Boone. Help me, he hollered. I'm coming undone.
Oh, yeah.
Decker took the moment. While Boone was held fast, he fled toward the gates. There wasn't much ground to cover. By the time Boone had struggled free of Narcissus, the enemy was within sight of unconsecrated earth. Boone gave chase. But before he was even halfway to the gates, he heard Decker's car door slam and the engine rev. The doctor was away. Damn it, away. What the fuck do I do with this? Boone heard Narcissus sob. He turned from the gates. The man had his guts looped between his hands like so much knitting. Go below, Boone said flatly. It was useless to curse Narcissus for his interference. Somebody will help you, he said. I can't. You think he was no longer concerned about Narcissus. It was the body sprawled on the walkway that had claimed his attention. In his hunger to terrorize Decker, he'd forgotten. They'll throw us both out, Narcissus was saying. Maybe, said Boone. What will we do? Just go below, Boone said wearily. Tell Mr. Lylesburg I led you astray. You did? Said Narcissus, then warmed to the idea. Yeah, I think you did. In his guts, he limped away. Boone knelt beside Lori. Her scent made him dizzy. The softness of her skin beneath his palms was almost overpowering. She was still alive, her pulse strong, but she must have endured it. As he gazed on her gentle face, the thought that she might wake up and see him in the shape he'd inherited from Pelletin's stressed him beyond.
Definitely a hitter.
In Decker's presence, he'd been proud to call himself a monster, to parade his night-breed self. But now, looking at the woman he had loved and had been loved by in return for his frailty and his humanity, he was ashamed. He inhaled, his will making flesh smoke, which his lungs drew back into his body. It was a process as strange in its ease as its nature. He had become accustomed to what he miraculous. But he was not compared with this woman. The fact that she'd enough faith to come looking for death on her heels was more than any natural man could hope for, and for one such as himself, a true miracle. Her humanity made him proud of what he'd been and could still pretend to be. So it was in human form he picked her up and tended to bring her underground. Chapter 13. The Prophetic Child. Laurie listened to the few.
All right. Got pretty good dab in there, so
I had no choice.
it's definitely a ripper.
So Midian's put at risk for your finer feelings. Decker won't tell anyone, Boone responded. What's he going to say? That he tried to kill a girl and a dead man stopped him? Talk sense. So suddenly you're the expert. A few days here and you're rewriting the law. We'll do it somewhere else, Boone. Take the woman and leave. Laurie wanted to open her eyes and go to Boone, calm him before his anger made him say or do something stupid. But her body was numb. Even the muscles of her face wouldn't respond to instructions. She was lie still and the argument raged. I belong here, Boone said. I'm Nightbreed now. Not any longer. I can't live out there. We did. For generations we took our chances in the natural world, and it nearly extinguished us. Now you come along and damn near destroy our one hope of surviving. If Midian's unearthed, you and the woman will be responsible. Think of that on your travels. There was a long silence. Then Boone said, let me make amends. Too late. The law makes no exceptions. The other one goes too. Narcissus? No, you'll break his heart. He spent half his life waiting to come here. The decision's made. Goodbye. You are Baphomet. At the sound of that name, Laurie felt a chill. The word meant nothing. Clearly it did to others nearby. She heard whispers echoing around her, repeated phrases like words of worship. I demand to speak with it, Boone said. Out of the question. What are you afraid of? Losing your grip on your tribe? I want to see Baphomet. If you want to try and stop me, do it now. As Boone threw the challenge down, Laurie's eyes opened. There was a vaulted roof above her where last there'd been sky. It was painted with stars, however, more fireworks than celestial bodies. Catherine wheels throwing off sparks as they rolled across the sky.
Oh, I'm getting there.
She inclined her head a little.
I
She
still
was in
got
a There were
a
sealed
ball.
coffins on every side of her, upended against the walls. To her left, a profusion of squat candles, their wax grimy, their flame as weak as she. To her right, the bed, sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching her intently. The child was dressed completely in black, her eyes catching the candlelight and studying its flicker. She was not pretty. Her face was too solemn for prettiness. Even in the smile she offered, seeing her wake, couldn't mellow the sadness. Laurie didn't want to return the welcoming look, but wasn't certain her muscles were yet obeying her. It was a bad hurt he did us, the vet said. Laurie assumed she meant Boone, but the child's next words put her right. Rachel made it clean. Now it doesn't sting. She raised her right hand. It was bandaged with dark linen around thumb and forefinger. Nor you either. Mustering her will, Laurie raised her own right hand from her side. It was bandaged identically. Where is Rachel? Laurie asked, her voice barely audible to herself. Babette heard the question clearly, however. Somewhere near, she said. Could you get her for me? Babette's perpetual frown deepened. Are you here forever? She asked. No, came the reply. Not from Laurie, but from Rachel, who had appeared at the door. No, she's not. She's going to be away very soon. Why? Said Babette. I heard Lylesburg, Laurie murmured. Mr. Lylesburg, Rachel said, crossing to where Laurie lay. Boone broke his word going.
Which are the ones?
He's put us all in danger. Lori understood only a fraction of Midian's story, but enough to know that the maxim she first heard from Lylesburg's lips, "What's below remains below," was not some idle catchphrase. It was a law the inhabitants of Midian had sworn to live by, or else forfeit their place here. "Can you help me?" she asked. She felt vulnerable lying on the floor. It wasn't Rachel who came to her aid, however, but Babette, by laying her small bandaged hand on Lori's stomach. Her system responded instantly to the child's touch, all trace of numbness leaving her body at once. She remembered the same sensation, or its like, from her last encounter with the girl. That feeling of transferred power that had moved through her when the beast had dissolved in her arms. "She's formed quite a bond with you," Rachel said. "So it seems." Lori sat up. "Is she hurt?" "Why don't you ask me?" Babette said. "I'm here too." "I'm sorry," Lori said, chastened. "Did you get cut too?" "No, but I felt your hurt." "She's empathic," Rachel said. "She feels what others feel, particularly if she has some emotional connection." "I knew you were coming here," Babette said. "I saw through your eyes, and you can see through mine." "Is that true?" Lori asked Rachel. "Believe her," came the reply. Lori wasn't quite certain she was ready to get to her feet yet, but she decided to put her body to the test. It was easier than she'd expected. She stood up readily, her limbs strong, her head clear. "Will you take me to Boone?" she requested. "If that's what you want." "He was here all along, wasn't he?" she said. "Yes." "Who brought him?" "Brought him? To Midian?" "Nobody." "He was almost dead," Lori said. "Somebody must have got him out of the mortuary." "You still don't understand, do you?" said Rachel grimly. "About Midian? No, not really. Not just Midian. About Boone, and why he's here." "He thinks he's Nightbreed," Lori said. "He was, until he broke his word." "So we'll go," Lori replied. "That's what Lylesburg wants, isn't it? And I've got no wish to stay." "Where will you go?" Rachel asked. "I don't know. Maybe back to Calgary. It shouldn't be so hard to prove Decker's the guilty man. Then we can start over." Rachel shook her head. "That won't be possible," she said. "Why not? Have you got some prior claim on him?" "He came here because he's one of us." "Us? Meaning what?" Lori replied sharply. She was tired of evasion and innuendo. "Who are you? Sick people living in the dark. Boone isn't sick. He's a sane man, a sane, healthy man." "I suggest you ask him how healthy he feels," was Rachel's retort. "Oh, I will, when the time comes." Babette was not untouched by this exchange of contempt. "You mustn't go," she said to Lori. "I have to. Not into the light." She took fierce hold of Lori's sleeve. "I can't come with you there." "She has to go," Rachel said, reaching over to prise her child loose. "She doesn't belong with us." Babette held fast. "You can," she said, looking up at Lori. "It's easy." "She doesn't want to," Rachel said. Babette looked up at Lori. "Is that true?" she asked. "Tell her," Rachel said, taking plain satisfaction in Lori's discomfort. "Tell her she's one of the sick people." "But we live forever," Babette said. She glanced at her mother. "Don't we?" "Some of us." "All of us, if we want to, live forever and ever. And one day, when the sun goes out—" "Enough," said Rachel. But Babette had more to say. "When the sun goes out and there's only night, we'll live on the earth. It'll be ours." Now it was Rachel's turn to be ill at ease. "She doesn't know what she's saying," the woman muttered. "I think she knows very well," Lori replied. The proximity of Babette and the thought that she had some bond with the child suddenly chilled her. What little peace her rational mind had made with Midian was rapidly crumbling. She wanted more than anything to be away from here, from children who talked of the end of the world, from candles and coffins and the life of the tomb. Where's Boone? She said to Rachel. Gone to the tabernacle, to Baphomet. What is Baphomet? Rachel made a ritualistic gesture at mention of Baphomet, touching her forefinger to tongue and heart. It was so familiar to her and so often performed, Laurie doubted she even knew she'd done it. Baphomet is the baptizer, she said, who made Midian, who called us here. Finger touched tongue and heart again. Will you take me to the tabernacle? Laurie asked. Rachel's reply was a plain and simple no. Direct me, at least. I'll take you, Babette volunteered. No, you won't, Rachel said, this time snatching the child's hand from Laurie's sleeve with such speed, Babette had no chance to resist. I've paid my debt to you, Rachel said, healing the wound. We've no more business together. She took hold of Babette and lifted the child up into her arms. Babette squirmed in her mother's embrace so as to look back at Laurie. I want you to see beautiful things for me. Be quiet, Rachel chided. What you see, I'll see, Laurie nodded. Yes, Babette said. Yes. Before her child could utter another mournful word, Rachel had carried her out of the room, leaving Laurie to the company of the coffins. She threw her head back and exhaled slowly. Calm, she thought. Be calm. It'll be over soon. The painted stars cavorted overhead, seeming to turn as she watched. Was their riot just the artist's fancy, she wondered? Or was this the way the sky looked to the breed when they stepped out of their mausoleums at night to take the air? Better not to know. It was bad enough that these creatures had children and art. That they might also have vision was too dangerous a thought to entertain. When first she'd encountered them, halfway down the stairs into this underworld, she'd feared for her life. She still did, in some hushed corner of herself. Not that it would be taken away, but that it would be changed. That somehow they'd taint her with their rights and visions, so she'd not be able to scrub them from her mind. The sooner she was out of here, with Boone beside her, the sooner she'd be back in Calgary. The streetlights were bright there. They tamed the stars. Reassured by the thought, she went in search of the baptizer. Chapter 14. Tabernacle. This was the true Midian, not the empty town on the hill, nor even the necropolis above her, but this network of tunnels and chambers, which presumably spread beneath the entire cemetery. Some of the tombs were occupied only by the undisturbed dead, their caskets laid on shelves to molder. Were these the first occupants of the cemetery, laid to rest here before the night breed had taken possession? Or were they breed who had died from their half-life, caught in the sun perhaps, or withered by longing? Whichever, they were in the minority. Most of the chambers were tenanted by more vital souls, their quarters lit by lamps or candles, or on occasion by the occupant itself, a being that burned with its own light. Only once did Laurie glimpse such an entity, supine on a mattress in the corner of its boudoir. It was naked, corpulent, and sexless, its sagging body a motley of dark, oily skin and larval eruptions that seeped phosphorescence, soaking its simple bed. It seemed every other doorway let onto some fragment as mysterious. Was it simply disgust that made her stomach flip, seeing the stigmatic in full flood, with sharp-toothed adherents sucking noisily at her wounds? Or excitement, confronting the legend of the vampire in the flesh? And what was she to make of the man whose body broke into birds when he saw her watching? Or the dog-headed painter who turned from his fresco and beckoned her to join his apprentice mixing paint? Or the machine beasts running up and down the walls on caliper legs? After a dozen corridors, she no longer knew horror from fascination. Perhaps she'd never know. She might have spent days lost and seeing the sights, But luck or instinct brought her close enough to Boone that further progress was blocked. It was Lylesburg's shadow that appeared before her, seeming to step from the solid wall. "You may go no farther." "I intend to find Boone," she told him. "You're not to blame in this," Lylesburg said. "That's completely understood. But you must in turn understand. What Boone did has put us all in danger." "Then let me speak to him. We'll get out of here together." "That might have been possible a little while ago," Lylesburg said, the voice emerging from his shadow coat as measured and authoritative as ever. "And now?" "He's beyond my recall. And yours, too. He's made appeal to another force entirely." Even as he spoke, there was noise from farther down the catacomb, a din, the like of which Lori had never heard. For an instant she felt certain an earthquake was its source. The sound seemed to be in and of the earth around them. But as the second wave began, she heard something animal in it, a moan of pain, perhaps, or of ecstasy. Surely this was Baphomet. Who made Midian, Rachel had said. What other voice could shake the very fabric of the place? Lylesburg confirmed the belief. "That is what Boone has gone to parley with," he said. "Or so he thinks." "Let me go to him." "It's already devoured him," Lylesburg said, "taken him into the flame." "I want to see for myself," Lori demanded. Unwilling to delay a moment longer, she pushed past Lylesburg, expecting resistance. But her hands sank into the darkness he wore and touched the wall behind him. He had no substance. He couldn't keep her from going anywhere. "It will kill you too," she heard him warn as she ran in pursuit of the sound. Though it was all around her, she sensed its source. Every step she took, it got louder and more complex. Layers of raw sound, each of which touched a different part of her. Head, heart, groin. A quick backward glance confirmed what she'd already guessed, that Lylesburg had made no attempt to follow. She turned a corner, and another, the undercurrents in the voice still multiplying, until she was walking against them as if in a high wind, head down, shoulders hunched. There were no chambers now along the passageway, and consequently no lights. There was a glow up ahead, however, fitful and cold, but bright enough to illuminate both the ground she stumbled over, which was bare earth, and the silvery frost on the walls. "Boone!" she shouted. "Are you there? Boone?" After what Lylesburg had said, she didn't hope too hard for an answer, but she got one. His voice came to meet her from the core of light and sound ahead, but all she heard through the din was, "Don't what?" she wondered. "Don't go any farther? Don't leave me here?" She slowed her pace and called again, but the noise the baptizer was making virtually drowned out the sound of her own voice, never mind a reply. Having come so far, she had to go forward, not knowing if his call had been warning or encouragement. Ahead, the passageway became a slope, a steep slope. She halted at the top and squinted into the brightness. The din Baphomet was making eroded the walls of the slope and carried the dust up into her face. Tears began to fill her eyes to wash the grit away, but it kept coming. Deafened by voice, blinded by dust, she teetered on the lip of the slope, unable to go forward or back. Suddenly, the baptizer fell silent, the layers of sound all dying at once. The hush that followed was more alarming than the din that had preceded it. Had it shut its mouth because it knew it had a trespasser in its midst? She held her breath, afraid to utter a sound. At the bottom of the slope was a sacred place. She had not the slightest doubt of that. Standing in the great cathedrals of Europe with her mother years before, gazing at the windows and the altars, she felt nothing approaching the surge of recognition she felt now. Nor in all her life, dreaming or awake, had such contradictory impulses run in her. She wanted to flee the place with a passion, wanted to forsake it and forget it, and yet it summoned. It was not Boone's presence there that called her, but the pull of the holy, or the unholy, or the two in one, and it wouldn't be resisted. Her tears had cleared the dust from her eyes now. She had no excuse but cowardice to remain where she stood. She began down the slope. It was a descent of 30 yards, but she'd covered no more than a third of it when a familiar figure staggered into view at the bottom. The last time she'd seen Boone had been over ground as he emerged to confront Decker. In the seconds before she'd passed out, she'd seen him as never before, like a man who'd forgotten pain and defeat entirely. Not so now. He could barely hold himself upright. She whispered his name, the word gathering weight as it tumbled toward him. He heard and raised his head toward her. Even in his worst times, when she'd rocked him and held him to keep the terrors at bay, she'd not seen such grief on his face as she saw now. Tears coming and coming, his features so crumpled with sorrow they were like a baby's. She began the descent again. Every sound her feet made, every tiny breath she took, multiplied by the acoustics of the slope. Seeing her approach, he left off holding himself up to wave her away, but in doing so lost his only means of support and fell heavily. She picked up her pace, careless now of the noise she was making. Whatever power occupied the pit at the bottom, it knew she was there. Most likely it knew her history. In a way, she hoped it did. She wasn't afraid of its judgment. She had loving reason for her trespass. She came weaponless and alone. If Baphomet was indeed the architect of Midian, then it understood vulnerability and would not act against her. She was within 5 yards of Boone by now. He was attempting to roll himself onto his back. "Wait," she said, distressed by his desperation. He didn't look her way, however. It was Baphomet his eyes went to once he got onto his back. Her gaze went with her into a room with walls of frozen earth and a floor the same. The latter split from corner to corner, and a fissure opened in it from which a flame column rose 4 or 5 times the size of a man. There was bitter cold off it rather than heat, and no reassuring flicker in its heart. Instead, its innards churned upon themselves, turning over and over some freight of stuff which she failed to recognize at first, but her appalled stare rapidly interpreted. There was a body in the fire, hacked limb from limb, human enough that she recognized it as flesh, but no more than that. Baphomet's doing, presumably, some torment visited on a transgressor. Boone said the baptizer's name even now, and she readied herself for sight of its face. She had it too, but from inside the flame, as the creature there, not dead, but alive, not Midian's subject, but its creator, rolled its head over in the turmoil of flame and looked her way. This was Baphomet, this diced and divided thing. Seeing its face, she screamed. No story or movie screen, no desolation, no bliss had prepared her for the maker of Midian. Sacred it must be, as anything so extreme must be sacred. A thing beyond things, beyond love or hatred or their sum, beyond the beautiful or the monstrous or their sum, beyond, finally, her mind's power to comprehend or catalogue. In the instant she looked away from it, she had already blanked every fraction of the sight from conscious memory and locked it where no torment or entreaty would ever make her look again. She hadn't known her own strength till the frenzy to be out of its presence had her hauling Boone to his feet and dragging him up the slope. He could do little to help her. The time he'd spent in the baptizer's presence had driven all but the rags of power from his muscles. It seemed to Laurie that it took an age staggering up to the head of the slope, the flames' icy light throwing their shadows before them like prophecies. The passageway above was deserted. She had half expected Lylesburg to be in wait somewhere with more solid cohorts, but the silence of the chamber below had spread throughout the tunnel. Once she'd hauled Boone a few yards from the summit of the slope, she halted, her lungs burning with the effort of bearing him up. He was emerging from the daze of grief or terror she'd found him in. "Do you know a way out of here?" she asked him. "I think so," he said. "You're going to have to give me some help. I can't support you much longer." He nodded, then looked back at the entrance to Baphomet's pit. "What did you see?" he asked. "Nothing." "Good." He covered his face with his hands. One of his fingers was missing, she saw, the wound fresh. He seemed indifferent to it, however, so she asked no questions, but concentrated on encouraging him to move. He was reluctant, almost sullen in the aftermath of high emotion, but she chivied him along until they reached a steep stairway that took them up through one of the mausoleums and into the night. The air smelled of distance after the confinement of the earth, but rather than linger to enjoy it, she insisted they get out of the cemetery, threading their way through the maze of tombs to the gate. There Boone halted. "The car's just outside," she said. He was shuddering, though the night was quite warm. "I can't," he said. "Can't what?" "I belong here." "No, you don't," she said. "You belong with me. We belong with each other." She stood close to him, but his head was turned toward the shadow. She took hold of his face in her hands and pulled his gaze round upon her. "We belong to each other, Boone. That's why you're alive. Don't you see? After all this, after all we've been through, we've survived." "It's not that easy." "I know that. We've both had terrible times. I understand things can't be the same. I wouldn't want them to be." "You don't know," he began. "Then you'll tell me," she said, "when the time's right. You have to forget Midian, Boone. It's already forgotten you." The shudders were not cold, but the precursors of tears, which broke now. "I can't go," he said. "I can't go." "We've got no choice," she reminded him. "All we've got is each other." The pain of his hurt was almost bending him double. "Stand up, Boone," she said. "Put your arms around me. The breed don't want you. They don't need you. I do. Boone, please." Slowly, he drew himself upright and embraced her. "Tight," she told him. "Hold me tight, Boone." His grip tightened. When she dropped her hands from his face to reciprocate, his gaze did not now return to the necropolis. He looked at her. "We're going to go back to the inn and pick up my things, yes? We have to do that. There are letters, photographs, lots of stuff we don't want anyone finding." "Then," he said, "then we find somewhere to go where no one will look for us and work out a way to prove you innocent." "I don't like the light," he said. "Then we'll stay out of it," she replied, "till you've got this damn place in perspective." She couldn't find anything in his face resembling an echo of her optimism. His eyes shone, but that was only the dregs of his tears. The rest of him was so cold, so much still a part of Midian's darkness. She didn't wonder at that. After all this night and the days that had preceded it had brought, she was surprised to find such capacity for hope in herself. But it was there, strong as a heartbeat. "I love you, Boone," she said, not expecting an answer. Maybe in time he'd speak up. If not words of love, at least of explanation. And if he didn't, or couldn't, it was not so bad. She had better than explanations. She had the fact of him, the flesh of him. His body was solid in her arms. Whatever claim Midian had upon his memories, Lylesburg had been perfectly explicit. He would never be allowed to return there. Instead, he would be beside her again at night, his simple presence more precious than any display of passion. And as time went by, she'd persuade him from the torments of Midian, as she had from the self-inflicted torments of his lunacy. She hadn't failed in that, as Decker's deceits had convinced her she had. Boone had not concealed a secret life from her. He was innocent, as was she. Innocence both, which fact had brought them alive through this precarious night and into the safety of the day. Part 4. Saints and Sinners. You want my advice? Kiss the devil, eat the worm. Jan de Moy. Another matter.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.